The marble floors of the Harrison mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. Victoria Harrison moved through the grand hallway with practiced silence, her bare feet making no sound against the cold stone. At 15 years old, she had learned that being quiet meant being invisible, and being invisible meant avoiding the disappointed looks that followed her everywhere. Her father, Richard Harrison, stood in his mahogany-paneled office speaking rapidly into his phone. Through the glass doors, Victoria could see his animated gestures and the familiar tension in his shoulders that appeared whenever business deals required his attention. She pressed her palm against the glass, hoping he might notice her presence, but his back remained turned as he paced behind his desk. The quarterly reports show a 15% increase. Richard's voice carried through the hallway as he spoke to someone Victoria couldn't see. We need to finalize the merger before the board meeting next week. Victoria's lips moved as she tried to read the words, but her father spoke too quickly and turned away too often for her to catch more than fragments. She had become skilled at reading lips over the years, but it only worked when people faced her and spoke clearly. Most of the time, the adults in her world seemed to forget she existed entirely. The household staff hurried past her in the hallway, carrying silver trays and arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, walked by with her usual brisk efficiency, her eyes focused straight ahead. When Victoria raised her hand in a small wave, Mrs. Patterson glanced in her direction but quickly looked away, as if acknowledging the girl might somehow complicate her daily routine. Victoria understood why the staff felt uncomfortable around her. Her father had never learned sign language, and he discouraged the household employees from attempting to communicate with her beyond basic gestures. She reads lips well enough, he often told visitors when they asked about his daughter's deafness. She manages just fine. But Victoria knew she wasn't managing fine at all. She spent most days wandering through the 30-room mansion like a ghost, observing a world that continued around her without including her in its conversations or decisions. Her tutors came and went on scheduled appointments, delivering their lessons through written materials and visual demonstrations, but they rarely attempted any real connection beyond their professional obligations. The mansion's library became Victoria's favorite refuge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound classics and contemporary novels that transported her to worlds where communication barriers didn't exist. She could lose herself for hours in stories about families who talked openly with each other, friends who shared secrets and dreams, communities where everyone belonged. On this particular Tuesday morning, Victoria sat curled in the window seat of the library, watching through the tall windows as gardeners trimmed the elaborate hedge maze that dominated the estate's back garden. The workers moved with purpose and coordination, clearly communicating through hand signals and shared glances as they shaped the towering green walls. She envied their easy collaboration and wished she could join them outside, but her father's rules kept her confined to the house during business hours. Too many distractions, he had explained through a hastily written note when she had asked about spending time in the gardens. You need to focus on your studies. Victoria's studies consisted primarily of independent reading and computer-based learning programs that her father's assistants had researched and purchased. She excelled academically, consistently scoring above grade level on her assessments, but her social development remained stunted by the isolation that surrounded her daily life. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the mansion, though Victoria felt only the vibration through the wooden floors. She peered around the corner to see her father adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, preparing to leave for another day of meetings and conferences that would keep him away until well past dinner time. For a moment, she considered approaching him, perhaps showing him the book she had been reading about a girl who learned to communicate with dolphins through sign language. But Richard Harrison was already reaching for his briefcase and checking his watch with the impatience that characterized all his movements. Victoria retreated to the library window seat and watched his black sedan disappear down the long driveway, leaving her alone with the staff who would spend the day maintaining the house around her while carefully avoiding any meaningful interaction. The morning passed slowly as Victoria moved through her usual routine. She completed her mathematics assignments on the computer, read 2 chapters of her history textbook, and practiced writing in her journal. The journal had been a suggestion from one of her tutors, who thought that written expression might help Victoria process her feelings about her unique situation. Most of her journal entries focused on her observations of other people's lives. She wrote about the gardener's teamwork, the way Mrs. Patterson's face softened when she thought no one was watching her arrange flowers, and the animated conversations she glimpsed between delivery drivers who came to the house. Everyone around her seemed to possess an effortless ability to connect with others that remained mysteriously beyond her reach. Around noon, Victoria heard footsteps approaching the library. She looked up to see Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway with a lunch tray, her expression neutral but not unkind. The woman set the tray on a small table near Victoria's reading chair and gestured toward the food with a brief smile. "Thank you," Victoria said aloud, though she couldn't hear her own voice to know if the words sounded clear. Mrs. Patterson nodded and turned to leave, but Victoria stood quickly and touched the woman's arm to get her attention. Victoria pointed to herself, then to Mrs. Patterson, then made a questioning gesture with her hands. She hoped to convey her desire for some kind of conversation, any form of communication that might break through the wall of silence that surrounded her days. Mrs. Patterson's face showed a moment of panic, as if Victoria had asked her to solve a complex mathematical equation. The older woman looked around the room nervously, then patted Victoria's shoulder in a gesture that seemed more dismissive than comforting. She pointed to the lunch tray and mouthed the word, "Eat," before hurrying from the room. Victoria sank back into her chair, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her like a heavy blanket. She picked at her lunch without appetite, watching through the windows as clouds gathered overhead and cast shadows across the perfectly maintained grounds. The afternoon brought her weekly appointment with Dr. Morrison, the speech therapist who had been working with Victoria for 3 years. Unlike the academic tutors, Dr. Morrison made genuine efforts to communicate with Victoria, though their sessions focused primarily on speech production and lip-reading skills rather than meaningful conversation. "Let's practice the consonant sounds we worked on last week," Dr. Morrison said, positioning herself directly in front of Victoria so the girl could read her lips clearly. "Remember to feel the vibrations in your throat." Victoria nodded and began the exercises, placing her hand on her throat to monitor the vibrations that indicated she was producing sound. These sessions always left her feeling frustrated because she could never hear whether her speech sounded natural or strained. Dr. Morrison's encouraging smiles and nods suggested improvement, but Victoria wondered if the woman was simply being kind. After an hour of drills and practice, Dr. Morrison gathered her materials and prepared to leave. "You're making excellent progress," she said, her words carefully enunciated for Victoria's benefit. "Continue practicing the exercises we reviewed today." Victoria wanted to ask Dr. Morrison about sign language, something she had researched extensively during her computer sessions. She had found videos online showing families and communities where deaf individuals communicated fluently through hand gestures and facial expressions that seemed far more natural and efficient than the laborious process of speech therapy. But before Victoria could formulate her question, Dr. Morrison was already walking toward the door, checking her phone and gathering her coat. The woman waved goodbye and disappeared into the hallway, leaving Victoria alone once again with her thoughts and questions. The late afternoon sun streamed through the library windows as Victoria returned to her reading. She had discovered a book about Helen Keller, whose story of overcoming communication barriers through the dedication of her teacher and Sullivan fascinated and inspired her. Victoria read about the breakthrough moment when Helen finally understood that the finger movements and was making in her palm represented words and concepts. Victoria tried to imagine what it would feel like to experience that kind of revelation, to suddenly understand that communication was possible in ways she had never considered. She practiced some of the finger spelling patterns she found illustrated in the book, though she had no one to practice with and no way to know if her movements were correct. As evening approached, the mansion grew quieter despite the continued presence of the household staff. Victoria could feel the vibrations of their movements through the floors as they prepared dinner and completed their evening cleaning routines, but the sounds that might have connected her to their activities remained beyond her reach. She wandered through the first-floor rooms, observing the careful arrangement of expensive furniture and artwork that transformed the house into something resembling a museum more than a home. Each room felt perfectly designed and completely empty of the warmth that came from shared experiences and conversations. In the formal dining room, a table that could seat 20 people stood ready for meals that were typically eaten by one person. Victoria's father usually worked through dinner, taking his meals in his office while continuing business calls and reviewing documents. The elaborate place settings and fresh flowers seemed almost mocking in their unused perfection. Victoria made her way to the kitchen, where she found the evening staff preparing her father's dinner tray. The cook, a middle-aged woman named Maria, looked up when Victoria entered and offered a warm smile that seemed more genuine than the polite acknowledgments she typically received from other staff members. Maria pointed to a plate of cookies cooling on the counter and gestured for Victoria to take one. Victoria nodded gratefully and selected a chocolate chip cookie that was still warm from the oven. For a moment, she lingered in the kitchen, enjoying the sense of purpose and activity that surrounded the dinner preparations. But when Maria turned back to her cooking and the other staff members continued their work, Victoria realized she was once again observing rather than participating. She finished her cookie and retreated to her bedroom, where she could watch the sun set over the estate grounds through her windows. Her bedroom was the one space in the mansion that felt somewhat personal, though even here the expensive furnishings and carefully coordinated decorations reflected her father's taste rather than her own preferences. Victoria had been allowed to choose some books and a few pieces of artwork, but the overall design maintained the same formal elegance that characterized the rest of the house. She sat at her desk and opened her journal, writing about the day's small interactions and her continuing sense of isolation. Her pen moved quickly across the paper as she described her longing for someone who might understand her need for real communication. Someone who would take the time to learn how to connect with her in ways that went beyond polite gestures and sympathetic smiles. Outside her window, the estate's security lights began to illuminate the pathways and garden areas. Victoria could see the night shift security guards beginning their rounds, checking the gates and monitoring the cameras that kept the property safe from intruders. Their walkie-talkies crackled with periodic updates that Victoria could see, but not hear. Another reminder of the conversations that happened constantly around her without including her. As she prepared for bed, Victoria thought about the book she had been reading and Helen Keller's description of her world before Sullivan arrived. Helen had written about feeling trapped in a dark and silent prison, unable to reach out to the people around her despite her desperate desire for connection. Victoria understood that feeling completely. She lived in a beautiful mansion surrounded by people who cared for her physical needs and educational requirements. But she remained fundamentally alone in ways that no amount of luxury could address. Her father's wealth had provided her with every material advantage, but it couldn't purchase the thing she wanted most, someone who would take the time to truly communicate with her. She turned off her bedside lamp and settled under her silk comforter, watching the shadows from the security lights play across her ceiling. Tomorrow would bring another day of silent observation, academic tasks completed in isolation, and brief encounters with staff members who smiled kindly but hurried away from any attempt at deeper connection. But as Victoria drifted toward sleep, she found herself hoping that Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather that drew Victoria to the large windows in the breakfast room. She watched the gardeners adjust their work schedules to take advantage of the mild temperature, starting earlier than usual to plant new flower beds before the afternoon heat set in. Their coordinated movements and silent communication continued to fascinate her, and she wished she could join them in their purposeful activity. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with Victoria's breakfast tray, but today her usual brisk efficiency seemed slightly disrupted. The head housekeeper glanced repeatedly toward the front entrance, and Victoria could sense an unusual tension in the woman's movements as she arranged the morning meal. "New staff member arriving today," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, facing Victoria so the girl could read her lips. The words were carefully enunciated, Victoria appreciated the woman's rare attempt at direct communication. Mrs. Patterson pointed toward the front of the house and made a gesture that Victoria interpreted as someone coming to work. Victoria nodded to show she understood, though she felt little enthusiasm about the arrival of another staff member who would likely treat her with the same polite distance that characterized all her interactions with the household employees. Over the years, she had watched dozens of workers come and go, and each new face brought the same pattern of awkward avoidance once they realized the challenge of communicating with the deaf daughter of their wealthy employer. She ate her breakfast slowly, savoring the perfectly prepared fruit and pastries while observing the increased activity in the front courtyard. Delivery trucks arrived with supplies for the kitchen and maintenance areas, and Victoria could see Mrs. Patterson directing traffic with her usual commanding presence. The head housekeeper's clipboard and quick gestures suggested the kind of organized chaos that accompanied any change in the household routine. Around 10 o'clock, Victoria noticed a taxi pulling up the circular driveway. A young black woman emerged from the vehicle, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a modest suitcase. Unlike the delivery drivers and other visitors who typically approach the mansion with obvious awe at its grandeur, this woman seemed unimpressed by the elaborate architecture and expensive landscaping. Victoria watched from her window as the woman paid the taxi driver and looked around the grounds with a calm, assessing gaze. There was something different about her posture and movement that caught Victoria's attention, though she couldn't immediately identify what set this person apart from other new employees she had observed arriving at the estate. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the front entrance and approached the newcomer with her standard professional greeting. Victoria could see the two women talking, but their distance from her window and the angle of their conversation made lip-reading impossible. The new employee nodded frequently and seemed to be asking questions that required detailed responses from Mrs. Patterson. What surprised Victoria most was the length of their conversation. Usually, new staff members received brief orientations focused on their specific duties and the household rules. But Mrs. Patterson and this woman talked for nearly 15 minutes, with both of them gesturing toward different areas of the estate and occasionally looking up at the mansion's windows. Victoria moved to a different window to get a better view, curious about what might require such an extensive discussion. As she watched, the new employee looked directly up at Victoria's position and seemed to see her standing there. Instead of quickly looking away like most people did when they accidentally made eye contact with her, the woman raised her hand and offered a genuine smile and wave. Victoria waved back tentatively, surprised by this simple acknowledgement of her presence. The gesture felt natural and friendly rather than the polite but distant greetings she usually received from household staff. For a moment, Victoria allowed herself to hope that this new employee might be different from the others. Mrs. Patterson led the woman toward the staff entrance at the side of the house, and Victoria lost sight of them as they disappeared inside. She remained at the window for several more minutes, wondering what role this newcomer would play in the household and whether their paths might cross in the coming days. Her morning tutoring session with Mr. Hendricks, her mathematics instructor, proceeded with its usual efficiency. Mr. Hendricks had developed a system of written problems and visual demonstrations that allowed Victoria to progress through advanced algebra concepts without requiring verbal communication. She appreciated his methodical approach, though she sometimes wished their lessons could include more interactive discussion about the practical applications of mathematical principles. Your problem-solving skills continue to improve, Mr. Hendricks wrote on a piece of paper after reviewing Victoria's completed assignments. Next week we'll begin working with geometric proofs. Victoria nodded and wrote, "Thank you" on her own paper, adding a question mark after geometric proofs to indicate her interest in learning more about the upcoming topic. Mr. Hendricks smiled and sketched a simple triangle with angle measurements, showing her a preview of the logical reasoning processes they would explore. As Mr. Hendricks gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Victoria heard footsteps in the hallway outside the library. Through the glass doors, she could see Mrs. Patterson leading someone on a tour of the main floor rooms. The new staff member followed attentively, taking notes in a small notebook while Mrs. Patterson explained various procedures and protocols. Victoria tried to focus on organizing her mathematics materials, but she found herself repeatedly glancing toward the hallway, hoping to catch another glimpse of the woman who had acknowledged her so naturally that morning. There had been something about that simple wave and smile that suggested a different kind of awareness, a recognition of Victoria as a person rather than an awkward complication in the household routine. After Mr. Hendricks left, Victoria moved to the library entrance where she could observe the ongoing orientation tour without being obvious about her interest. Mrs. Patterson was explaining the cleaning schedule for the formal rooms, pointing out specific pieces of artwork and furniture that required special attention. The new employee nodded and asked questions that Victoria could partially read from her lip movements. The woman seemed particularly interested in the daily routines of the household and the schedules of its residents. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned Victoria by name, pointing toward the library, the newcomer looked directly at Victoria through the glass doors. Instead of the usual expression of uncertainty or discomfort that crossed most people's faces when they learned about the deaf girl who lived in the mansion, this woman's face showed genuine interest and what looked like understanding. She said something to Mrs. Patterson that Victoria couldn't decipher, but Mrs. Patterson's response seemed surprised and pleased. Victoria retreated deeper into the library, not wanting to appear to be eavesdropping on the conversation, but she continued to watch through peripheral vision as the tour continued. The new staff member's body language remained confident and engaged, and she seemed to be asking follow-up questions that required detailed answers from Mrs. Patterson. Lunch arrived through its usual routine, with Maria from the kitchen staff delivering a perfectly prepared meal to Victoria's preferred spot in the morning room. But today Maria lingered for a moment after setting down the tray, and she gestured toward the window with an expression of curiosity. "New person," Maria said carefully, facing Victoria and speaking more slowly than usual. "She seems nice." Victoria nodded and tried to formulate a response that might encourage Maria to share more information about the newcomer. She pointed to herself, then to the window, then made a questioning gesture with her hands, hoping to convey her interest in learning more about the new employee. Maria seemed to understand and nodded enthusiastically. She pointed toward the staff areas of the house and held up her hands to indicate someone working. Then she smiled and gave Victoria a thumbs-up gesture, suggesting that her first impression of the new staff member had been positive. This small exchange with Maria represented more substantive communication than Victoria usually experienced with the household staff, and she felt grateful for the woman's attempt to include her in the general awareness of household developments. She ate her lunch with more appetite than usual, energized by the sense that today might offer more opportunities for connection. The afternoon passed with Victoria's standard routine of independent study and reading, but she found it difficult to concentrate on her assignments. The knowledge that a new person was somewhere in the house, learning about the routines and procedures that governed daily life at the estate, created an unusual sense of anticipation that disrupted her usual focus. Around 3 o'clock, Victoria heard activity in the hallway outside the library. She looked up from her history textbook to see Mrs. Patterson leading the new staff member toward the back of the house, probably showing her the laundry facilities and storage areas that completed the orientation tour. As they passed the library entrance, the newcomer glanced inside and saw Victoria sitting at her reading table. The woman paused for a moment, despite Mrs. Patterson's continued walking, and raised her hand in another friendly wave. But this time, she also touched her chest with her fingertips and then pointed toward Victoria with a gentle questioning expression. Victoria wasn't sure how to interpret this gesture, but something about the woman's body language suggested a form of communication that seemed more intentional than a simple greeting. She waved back and pointed to herself, then made a small questioning gesture to indicate her own curiosity about the newcomer. The woman smiled broadly at Victoria's response and nodded as if Victoria had answered a question correctly. She touched her chest again and then spelled out letters with her fingers, moving slowly and clearly. Mnarwai. Victoria's heart began to beat faster as she realized what she was witnessing. The new staff member was using sign language to introduce herself. Victoria had studied enough online videos to recognize the fingerspelling alphabet, and she quickly understood that the woman's name was Mary. Victoria pointed to herself and carefully spelled out her own name, Victoria. Mary's face lit up with obvious pleasure, and she nodded enthusiastically before Mrs. Patterson's voice called her attention back to the tour. But before following Mrs. Patterson down the hallway, Mary looked directly at Victoria and signed a phrase that Victoria recognized from her online research. "Nice to meet you." The gesture was clear and confident, indicating that Mary was fluent in American Sign Language. Victoria sat frozen at her reading table for several minutes after Mary disappeared from view, trying to process what had just happened. In less than 30 seconds, she had experienced more direct and natural communication than she typically received in an entire week. Someone in her house now possessed the ability to talk with her in a language designed specifically for people like herself. The realization filled Victoria with an excitement she hadn't felt in years, combined with anxiety about what this development might mean for her carefully controlled daily routine. Her father had always discouraged sign language, preferring that Victoria focus on speech therapy and lip reading as more normal forms of communication. But Mary's presence suggested that alternatives existed and that someone was willing to use them. Victoria spent the rest of the afternoon trying to concentrate on her studies while anticipating her next encounter with Mary. She reviewed the sign language resources she had bookmarked on her computer, refreshing her memory of basic conversational phrases and common vocabulary words. For the first time in months, she felt motivated to learn something for reasons beyond academic achievement. Dinner time approached with its usual solitary routine. Victoria ate in the morning room while her father worked late at the office, served by staff members who performed their duties with quiet efficiency. But tonight she found herself watching every shadow in the hallway and listening for footsteps that might indicate Mary's presence in the nearby areas of the house. Around 8 o'clock, Victoria heard someone approaching the morning room. She looked up hopefully, expecting to see Mary, but instead Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with her usual professional demeanor. The head housekeeper seemed unusually thoughtful as she checked on Victoria's dinner progress. "The new staff member has interesting qualifications," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, making sure Victoria could read her lips clearly. "She has experience working with special situations." Victoria nodded to encourage Mrs. Patterson to continue, hoping for more information about Mary's background and responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers, then moved closer to Victoria's table. "She specifically requested assignment to your areas of the house," Mrs. Patterson continued carefully. "She seems to have relevant training." The implications of this statement sent another wave of excitement through Victoria. Mary had not only arrived at the mansion by coincidence, but had apparently sought out a position that would involve working in the areas where Victoria spent most of her time. This suggested that Mary's sign language skills were not accidental, but represented professional qualifications that she intended to use. Victoria wanted to ask Mrs. Patterson dozens of questions about Mary's background, training, and specific duties, but the head housekeeper's body language suggested that she had already shared more information than usual. Mrs. Patterson collected Victoria's dinner dishes and prepared to leave, but she paused at the doorway. "Tomorrow you might see more of her around the house," Mrs. Patterson said with what looked like the beginning of a smile. "I think you'll find her helpful." After Mrs. Patterson left, Victoria paced around the morning room, too energized to sit still or focus on evening reading. The possibility that tomorrow might bring genuine conversation and connection created an anticipation that made her usual bedtime routine seem impossible to contemplate. She made her way to her bedroom and sat at her desk to write in her journal. But for the first time in months, she struggled to find words for her experiences. How could she describe the simple gesture of someone spelling her name in sign language, or the way Mary's confident communication had made her feel instantly understood? Victoria woke earlier than usual on Tuesday morning, drawn from sleep by the unfamiliar sensation of anticipation rather than her typical sense of routine obligation. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny messengers of possibility. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, hoping to catch sight of Mary beginning her first full day of work. The morning room stood empty when Victoria arrived for breakfast, but she could sense increased activity throughout the house. Footsteps moved with purpose through the hallways, and vibrations through the wooden floors suggested the kind of busy energy that accompanied changes in daily routines. Victoria positioned herself near the large windows where she could observe both the front courtyard and the interior hallway while she waited for her breakfast to arrive. Maria appeared with the morning meal, her usual warm smile enhanced by an expression of curiosity that reminded Victoria of their brief conversation about Mary the previous day. As Maria arranged the breakfast dishes, she glanced repeatedly toward the hallway and seemed to be listening for something that Victoria couldn't hear. "New person starting today," Maria said carefully, facing Victoria with the deliberate speech patterns that indicated her attempt to communicate clearly. "She asked about you." Victoria's fork stopped halfway to her mouth as she processed this unexpected information. Mary had specifically asked about her, which suggested that their brief sign language exchange the previous afternoon had made an impression on the new staff member. Victoria pointed to herself with a questioning expression, wanting to encourage Maria to share more details. Maria nodded enthusiastically and moved closer to Victoria's table, lowering her voice despite the fact that Victoria couldn't hear the volume of her words anyway. "She knows special talking," Maria continued, making vague hand gestures that Victoria interpreted as a reference to sign language. "She seems excited to meet you properly." The knowledge that Mary was excited about meeting her sent a warm feeling through Victoria's chest that she hadn't experienced in years. Someone was actually looking forward to communicating with her rather than avoiding the challenge of her deafness. She smiled at Maria and tried to convey her own excitement through her expression and body language. After Maria left to continue her morning duties, Victoria found it impossible to concentrate on her breakfast. She moved restlessly around the morning room, checking the windows for any sign of Mary while trying to calm the nervous energy that made her hands shake slightly. The possibility of real conversation felt almost too wonderful to believe, and she worried that her expectations might lead to disappointment. Around 9 o'clock, Victoria spotted movement in the hallway outside the morning room. Mrs. Patterson walked past with her usual efficient stride, followed by Mary carrying a basket of cleaning supplies and what looked like a small notebook. Victoria's heart rate increased as she realized that Mary's duties apparently included working in the main areas of the house, where Victoria spent most of her time. Mary paused outside the morning room entrance and looked inside, her face lighting up when she saw Victoria sitting near the windows. Instead of the hurried wave of the previous day, Mary set down her supplies and stepped into the room with a confident smile that conveyed genuine pleasure at seeing Victoria again. "Good morning," Mary signed clearly, her hands moving with the fluent grace that indicated native-level proficiency in American Sign Language. "How are you today?" Victoria stared for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of someone asking her a direct question in a language she could understand completely. She had practiced basic responses the previous evening, but the reality of actual conversation felt almost surreal after years of one-sided communication attempts. "I'm good," Victoria signed back, her movements hesitant and uncertain compared to Mary's smooth fluency. "Thank you for asking." Mary's smile grew broader at Victoria's response, and she nodded encouragingly. "Your signing looks very good," she signed, moving slowly so Victoria could follow every gesture clearly. "Have you been studying ASL?" Victoria nodded and pointed toward her bedroom upstairs, then made gestures indicating computer use and studying. Mary seemed to understand immediately and signed, "Self-taught? That's impressive. You have natural ability." The praise made Victoria flush with pleasure and surprise. No one had ever complimented her communication skills before. Most people seemed to view her attempts at connection as obstacles to overcome rather than achievements to acknowledge. Mary's recognition of her efforts felt like validation of years of isolated study and practice. "I have to work now," Mary signed, glancing toward her cleaning supplies. "But we can talk more later if you'd like. What time are you usually free?" Victoria thought quickly about her daily schedule of tutoring sessions and independent study time. "After 2 o'clock," she signed, In the library. I read there most afternoons. Perfect, Mary signed back. I'll find you there when I finish my morning duties. We can have a real conversation then. The word conversation sent another wave of excitement through Victoria. She signed, "Thank you," with an enthusiasm that made Mary laugh silently, her eyes sparkling with amusement and what looked like affection. Mary picked up her supplies and headed toward the formal rooms, but she turned back once to wave goodbye with the same natural friendliness that had characterized all their interactions. Victoria spent the remainder of the morning in a state of distracted anticipation that made her regular activities feel almost impossible to complete. Her session with Dr. Morrison, the speech therapist, passed in a blur of consonant exercises and lip-reading drills that seemed suddenly irrelevant compared to the prospect of fluent sign language conversation that awaited her that afternoon. "You seem particularly energetic today," Dr. Morrison observed as Victoria struggled to focus on the lesson plan. "Is there something special happening?" Victoria wanted to share her excitement about Mary and the possibility of finally having someone to talk with, but she worried that Dr. Morrison might disapprove of sign language or report the development to her father. Instead, she simply nodded and tried to redirect her attention to the speech exercises, though her thoughts kept drifting to the conversation planned for that afternoon. Lunch arrived with its usual punctuality, but Victoria found herself eating quickly and checking the clock repeatedly as 2 o'clock approached. She had spent part of the morning reviewing sign language vocabulary online, preparing topics and questions she wanted to discuss with Mary. The prospect of expressing her thoughts and feelings to someone who could understand and respond felt almost overwhelming in its significance. At exactly 2 o'clock, Victoria positioned herself in the library with a book open in front of her, though she couldn't concentrate enough to read the words on the page. She watched the entrance nervously, wondering if Mary would remember their appointment or if household duties might prevent her from keeping their planned meeting. Footsteps in the hallway announced someone's approach, and Victoria looked up to see Mary entering the library with a warm smile and what appeared to be genuine excitement about their upcoming conversation. Mary had changed from her work uniform into a simple dress that made her look less like a staff member and more like a potential friend. "I hope you don't mind that I'm a few minutes late," Mary signed as she approached Victoria's reading area. "Mrs. Patterson wanted to discuss my schedule for the rest of the week." "I don't mind at all," Victoria signed back, grateful that Mary had actually come and that their conversation was beginning with the kind of casual politeness that characterized normal social interactions. "I'm just happy you're here." Mary settled into a chair across from Victoria's reading table, her relaxed posture suggesting that she had time for an extended conversation rather than a brief, hurried exchange. "Tell me about yourself," she signed. "What do you like to do? What are you interested in?" The open-ended question represented a type of inquiry that Victoria had dreamed of receiving for years. Someone was actually asking about her thoughts and preferences rather than simply acknowledging her presence or managing her physical needs. She took a moment to consider how to respond, wanting to make the most of this unprecedented opportunity for self-expression. "I love to read," Victoria signed, gesturing toward the bookshelves that surrounded them. "Books are my escape to worlds where communication isn't a problem. I also like to watch people working together, like the gardeners outside. They seem to understand each other so easily." Mary nodded thoughtfully and signed, "Reading is wonderful, but watching other people communicate must be both fascinating and frustrating for you. Do you feel isolated here?" The directness of Mary's question surprised Victoria, who had never been asked to describe her emotional experience so explicitly. Most people seemed uncomfortable acknowledging her isolation, preferring to focus on practical aspects of her education and daily care rather than her feelings about her situation. "Very isolated," Victoria signed honestly. "My father means well, but he doesn't understand how lonely it gets. The staff are kind, but they don't know how to talk with me. Until now, I haven't had anyone to really communicate with." Mary's expression grew more serious as she absorbed Victoria's response. "That must be incredibly difficult," she signed. "Communication is a basic human need. Everyone deserves to be heard and understood." The validation of her experience brought tears to Victoria's eyes that she tried to blink away quickly. Someone finally, understood that her isolation wasn't just an inconvenience or a challenge to overcome, but a fundamental barrier to her emotional and social development that had real consequences for her well-being. "Why did you come here?" Victoria signed, curious about Mary's motivation for seeking employment at the Harrison mansion. "Do you usually work with deaf people?" Mary paused for a moment before responding, her expression suggesting that the answer involved some complexity. "I studied to be a teacher of the deaf," she signed. "But I needed work that paid well to help support my family. When I learned that this position might allow me to use my ASL skills, I specifically requested assignment to this household." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward whatever circumstances had brought Mary to their house. "So you came here for me?" she signed, hardly daring to believe that someone had deliberately sought out the opportunity to work with her. "I came here because I believe that every deaf person deserves access to their natural language." Mary signed with conviction that made her gestures particularly emphatic. Sign language isn't inferior to speech. It's a complete, beautiful language that allows for full expression of thoughts and emotions. You have the right to communicate fluently. The concept of having rights related to communication represented a completely new way of thinking for Victoria. Her father had always framed sign language as a crutch or accommodation rather than a legitimate form of expression. Mary's perspective suggested that Victoria's preference for visual communication was valid and valuable in its own right. "My father doesn't approve of sign language," Victoria signed, glancing toward the office areas where Richard Harrison conducted his business. "He thinks I should focus on speaking and lip reading to be more normal." Mary's face showed a flash of what looked like controlled anger, though her signing remained calm and supportive. "There's nothing abnormal about being deaf," she signed clearly. "Your father loves you, but he may not understand that forcing you to communicate in ways that don't come naturally actually limits your ability to express yourself fully." Victoria had never heard anyone suggest that her father might be wrong about communication strategies, and the idea both excited and worried her. "What if he doesn't want us to talk together?" she signed, voicing her greatest fear about this new relationship. "We'll address that situation if it arises," Mary signed with quiet confidence. "But right now, let's focus on developing your communication skills and helping you feel less isolated. That's what matters most." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that Victoria had never been able to discuss with anyone. Mary asked about her educational interests, her hopes for the future, and her feelings about living in such an elaborate but emotionally distant environment. Victoria found herself sharing thoughts and experiences that she had only written about in her private journal. Mary's responses demonstrated not only fluent sign language skills, but also genuine interest in Victoria's perspective and experiences. She asked follow-up questions that encouraged Victoria to elaborate on her thoughts, and she offered insights about deaf culture and community that Victoria had never considered. "There are schools and communities where deaf people communicate freely in ASL," Mary signed, "where being deaf isn't seen as a disability, but as a different way of experiencing the world. You might enjoy meeting other deaf young people who share your experiences." The idea of meeting other deaf teenagers filled Victoria with excitement and longing. She had never encountered another deaf person her age, and the prospect of communicating with people who understood her situation felt almost magical in its appeal. "Could I really meet other deaf people?" Victoria signed eagerly. "Would they want to be friends with someone who's just learning ASL?" "Of course," Mary signed with an encouraging smile. "The deaf community is very welcoming to people who are discovering their language and culture. You'd fit in beautifully once you gain more confidence in your signing skills." The session ended when Mrs. Patterson appeared in the library doorway, indicating that Mary's break time had concluded and that she needed to return to her afternoon duties. Mary stood reluctantly, clearly wishing their conversation could continue longer. "Same time tomorrow?" Mary signed, and Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "This was the best afternoon I've had in years," Victoria signed, her expression conveying the depth of her gratitude and happiness. Mary smiled warmly and signed, "It was wonderful for me too." During the remainder of the week passed in a blur of afternoon conversations that transformed Victoria's daily routine from isolated endurance into eager anticipation. Each meeting with Mary brought new vocabulary, deeper discussions, and growing confidence in Victoria's ability to express complex thoughts and feelings through sign language. By Friday, Victoria's movements had become more natural and fluent, and she found herself thinking in visual concepts rather than struggling to translate between spoken and sign communications. Mary's approach to their conversations went far beyond basic language instruction. She introduced Victoria to concepts about deaf culture, community, and identity that challenged everything Victoria had previously understood about her place in the world. Through Mary's explanations, Victoria began to see her deafness not as a limitation to overcome, but as a different way of experiencing and interacting with her environment. Deaf people have their own rich culture, just like any ethnic or linguistic group, Mary signed during one of their afternoon sessions in the library. We have our own art forms, storytelling traditions, and ways of understanding the world that hearing people often don't recognize or appreciate. Victoria absorbed this information with fascination and growing pride. The idea that her deafness connected her to a larger community with its own valuable traditions represented a complete reversal of her previous understanding of herself as an isolated individual struggling to adapt to a hearing world. Can you show me some examples of deaf art or stories? Victoria signed, eager to learn about these cultural elements that Mary described with such obvious affection and respect. Mary's eyes lit up at the request. Over the following days, she shared stories about deaf poets who created works that played with the visual nature of sign language, deaf actors who brought unique perspectives to theatrical performances, and deaf educators who had developed teaching methods that recognized the strengths of visual learning rather than focusing on what deaf students couldn't hear. These conversations opened up possibilities that Victoria had never imagined. She began to envision herself not as someone who needed to be fixed or accommodated, but as someone who might contribute to a community that valued her perspective and experiences. The transformation in her self-concept was profound and energizing. But as Victoria's confidence and excitement grew, so did her awareness that these changes would eventually come to her father's attention. The household staff had begun to notice the dramatic improvement in Victoria's mood and energy levels, and several of them had commented to Mrs. Patterson about the positive effects of Mary's presence in the house. The inevitable confrontation came on a Friday evening when Richard Harrison arrived home earlier than usual and found Victoria practicing sign language in the library. She was so absorbed in working through a story that Mary had taught her that she didn't notice her father standing in the doorway, watching her animated gestures with an expression that combined surprise, concern, and something that looked like disapproval. Victoria sensed movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see her father standing with his arms crossed, his business suit rumpled from a long day of meetings, his face showing the kind of controlled tension that usually preceded difficult conversations. Her hands froze mid-sentence as she realized that her secret afternoon sessions with Mary were about to become a family issue. Richard Harrison entered the library with the deliberate stride that his business associates recognized as a signal of serious intent. He positioned himself directly in front of Victoria's reading chair, his body language conveying the authority that made him successful in corporate negotiations but often felt intimidating in family interactions. "We need to talk," he said, enunciating clearly so Victoria could read his lips without difficulty. "I've been hearing reports about new activities you've been engaging in with one of the staff members." Victoria nodded nervously, unsure whether her father's tone indicated curiosity or disapproval, but sensing that this conversation would determine whether her newfound connection with Mary could continue. She had dreaded this moment, while simultaneously hoping that her father might somehow understand and support her need for sign language communication. Richard settled into the chair across from Victoria's reading area, his expression serious but not hostile. "Mrs. Patterson tells me that you've been spending time with Mary, the new housekeeper, and that she's been teaching you sign language." The way her father pronounced sign language suggested that he viewed it as something foreign and potentially problematic rather than a legitimate form of communication. Victoria chose her response carefully, knowing that her father's decision about continuing these sessions could determine the direction of her social and emotional development. Yes, Victoria said aloud, supplementing her speech with fingerspelling to demonstrate her growing skills. Mary helps me communicate better. I can express myself more clearly with her than with anyone else. Richard's eyebrows rose as he watched Victoria's finger movements, and his expression suggested that he was evaluating this new development from multiple angles. I've always believed that your speech therapy and lip-reading skills were sufficient for your communication needs, he said slowly. Why do you think you need this alternative method? Victoria took a deep breath, recognizing that this moment represented her first opportunity to advocate for herself and her communication preferences with her father. Mary's conversations had given her both the vocabulary and the confidence to articulate her needs more clearly than ever before. Speech therapy helps me produce sounds, but it doesn't help me understand everything that people say, Victoria responded, using both voice and signs to emphasize her point. With sign language, I can have complete conversations. I can ask questions and understand detailed answers. I can express complex thoughts and feelings. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with the analytical attention he typically applied to business problems. Victoria could see him processing her explanation and comparing it with his previous assumptions about her communication abilities and needs. Mary seems like a competent employee, Richard said after a long pause. But I'm concerned about whether this sign language focus might interfere with the progress you've made in speech and lip reading. Dr. Morrison has worked very hard to develop your oral communication skills. Victoria felt a surge of frustration at her father's emphasis on oral communication as the primary goal of her development. Mary's influence had helped her understand that communication effectiveness mattered more than the specific method used to achieve it, and she wanted her father to understand this perspective. Dr. Morrison's work has been helpful. Victoria signed and spoke simultaneously. But it's only one part of communication. Sign language doesn't replace speech therapy. It gives me another tool for connecting with people. The goal should be communication that works, not communication that looks normal to hearing people. The directness of Victoria's response clearly surprised Richard, who had never heard his daughter articulate such a clear position about her own needs and preferences. He studied her face for a long moment, and Victoria could see him reassessing his assumptions about her awareness of her situation and her ability to make informed decisions about her own development. You seem more confident lately, Richard observed. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that your overall demeanor has changed significantly since Mary began working here. You appear more engaged and energetic. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, grateful that her father had noticed the positive changes that her conversations with Mary had produced. I feel more like myself than I have in years, she signed and spoke. When I can communicate easily with someone, I can share my thoughts and interests instead of just responding to questions or following instructions. Richard's expression grew more thoughtful as he absorbed this explanation. What kinds of things do you discuss with Mary? What has she been teaching you beyond the sign language basics? Victoria hesitated, unsure how her father would react to Mary's discussions about deaf culture and community. These concepts challenged many of the assumptions that had guided Victoria's upbringing, and she worried that Richard might view Mary's teaching as inappropriate or subversive. We talk about books I've been reading, ideas I'm interested in, and my feelings about living here, Victoria began carefully. Mary also tells me about other deaf people who have interesting careers and accomplishments. She helps me understand that being deaf doesn't mean being limited. Richard nodded slowly, his business-trained mind clearly processing the implications of Victoria's expanded self-awareness and growing confidence. And what does Mary suggest about your future? What options does she present for your continuing education and development? This question touched on the most exciting and potentially controversial aspects of Victoria's conversations with Mary. The discussions about deaf schools, deaf community organizations, and educational opportunities designed specifically for deaf students represented possibilities that had never been part of Richard's planning for his daughter's future. Mary thinks I might benefit from meeting other deaf young people, Victoria said, watching her father's face carefully for his reaction. She believes I would thrive in educational environments where sign language is the primary form of communication rather than an accommodation. Richard's expression grew more serious as he considered this information. Victoria could see him weighing the potential benefits of specialized deaf education against his preference for integrating Victoria into mainstream hearing environments. The decision clearly involved complex considerations that went beyond simple academic achievement. "These are significant educational decisions," Richard said finally. "I want to make sure that any changes we consider are truly in your best interests rather than convenient for the people teaching you." Victoria appreciated her father's caution, but she also felt frustrated by his implication that Mary might be pursuing her own convenience rather than Victoria's development. Mary's dedication to their afternoon sessions and her obvious investment in Victoria's progress suggested genuine commitment to helping Victoria reach her full potential. "Mary isn't trying to make things convenient for herself," Victoria signed and spoke with some heat. "She's helping me discover abilities and possibilities that I never knew existed. For the first time in my life, I feel like I have access to my full intelligence and personality, not just the parts that can be expressed through limited communication methods." Richard studied Victoria's animated response with obvious surprise at her passionate defense of Mary and sign language. He seemed to be recognizing aspects of his daughter's personality that had been hidden or suppressed by her communication limitations, and Victoria could see him reconsidering his previous assessments of her capabilities and needs. "I want to meet with Mary directly," Richard announced after several minutes of thoughtful silence. "I'd like to understand her qualifications, her teaching methods, and her recommendations for your continued development. If sign language is genuinely beneficial for you, I want to ensure you're receiving the best possible instruction." Victoria felt a mixture of relief and anxiety at her father's decision to investigate further rather than immediately prohibiting her sessions with Mary. This approach suggested that he was taking her communication needs seriously, but it also meant that Mary would need to defend her methods and recommendations to someone who might be skeptical of sign language education. "Mary has excellent qualifications," Victoria signed and spoke quickly, wanting to prepare her father for a positive impression of Mary's background and abilities. "She studied to be a teacher of the deaf, and she knows more about deaf education and culture than anyone else I've ever met." Richard nodded and stood up from his chair, signaling that their conversation was concluding but that the larger discussion about Victoria's communication and education would continue. "I'll schedule a meeting with Mary next week," he said. "In the meantime, you may continue your afternoon sessions with her, but I want regular updates about what you're learning and how these lessons are affecting your other educational activities." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude and excitement at her father's decision to allow her sessions with Mary to continue while he evaluated the situation. This represented the first time that Richard Harrison had seriously considered modifying his approach to Victoria's development based on her own expressed preferences and needs. "Thank you for listening to me," Victoria signed and spoke, her expression conveying the depth of her appreciation for her father's willingness to reconsider his previous positions. "I think you'll be impressed with Mary's knowledge and teaching abilities." Richard smiled slightly at Victoria's obvious enthusiasm, and for a Monday morning arrived with unusual tension throughout the Harrison mansion as staff members prepared for the unprecedented meeting between Richard Harrison and Mary about Victoria's sign language education. Mrs. Patterson had scheduled the conference for 10 o'clock in Richard's office, creating a formal atmosphere that reflected the serious nature of the decisions that might emerge from their discussion. Victoria spent the early morning hours in a state of nervous anticipation, alternating between confidence in Mary's qualifications and worry about her father's potential reaction to recommendations that might challenge his long-held beliefs about deaf education. She positioned herself in the library where she could observe the hallway leading to her father's office, hoping to gauge the mood and outcome of the meeting through whatever visual clues might be available. Mary arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, dressed in professional attire that emphasized her credentials as an educator rather than her role as household staff. Victoria watched through the library windows as Mary walked up the front steps with the confident posture of someone prepared to advocate effectively for her students' needs and rights. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson escorted Mary to Richard's office, and Victoria could see through the glass doors that her father had arranged the seating to create an atmosphere of serious business discussion rather than informal conversation. Richard sat behind his imposing mahogany desk while Mary took the chair across from him, her notebook and several manila folders suggesting that she had prepared extensively for this meeting. Victoria tried to focus on her morning studies, but concentration proved impossible as she wondered about the conversation taking place just down the hallway. She found herself checking the office windows every few minutes, looking for changes in body language or facial expressions that might indicate whether the discussion was proceeding favorably. The meeting lasted for nearly 2 hours, far longer than Victoria had expected for what she had assumed would be a brief evaluation of Mary's qualifications and teaching methods. The extended duration suggested that her father was asking detailed questions and that Mary was providing comprehensive responses about deaf education, sign language acquisition, and Victoria's specific learning needs. Around noon, Victoria heard movement in the hallway and saw her father and Mary emerging from the office together. Their expressions appeared serious but not hostile, and Victoria noticed that Mary was carrying additional papers that Richard had apparently provided for her review. The two adults walked toward the library together, and Victoria realized that they were coming to include her in the conclusion of their discussion. Richard entered the library with Mary beside him, their combined presence creating an atmosphere of significant decision-making that made Victoria's heart rate increase with anticipation and anxiety. She set aside her textbook and gave them her full attention, knowing that the next few minutes might determine the entire direction of her future educational and social development. "Victoria," Richard began, positioning himself where his daughter could read his lips clearly. "I've had a very informative conversation with Mary about your communication needs and the potential benefits of continued sign language instruction." Victoria nodded, trying to read her father's expression for clues about his conclusions regarding Mary's recommendations. Richard's face showed the kind of thoughtful seriousness that characterized his most important business decisions, suggesting that he was approaching this family matter with the same analytical rigor that made him successful in corporate environments. "Mary has impressive qualifications," Richard continued, "and she's presented compelling evidence about the academic and social advantages that fluent sign language skills can provide for deaf students. I'm convinced that her teaching methods are sound and that her goals for your development are appropriate." Relief flooded through Victoria as she absorbed her father's positive assessment of Mary's credentials and approach. The validation of Mary's expertise meant that their afternoon sessions could continue without the constant worry that Richard might terminate this valuable relationship based on misconceptions about sign language education. Mary stepped forward and began signing as she spoke, including Victoria directly in the conversation in a way that demonstrated the natural bilingual communication style that had become comfortable during their previous sessions. "Your father and I have discussed several options for expanding your sign language education beyond our current afternoon meetings," she signed and said simultaneously. Victoria's excitement grew as she realized that the meeting had produced not just permission to continue her current lessons, but plans for additional learning opportunities that might accelerate her progress and expand her access to deaf community resources. "We've identified a summer program at the State School for the Deaf," Richard explained, "that offers intensive sign language instruction and cultural education for deaf teenagers who are transitioning to ASL-based communication. The program includes both academic courses and social activities designed to help students develop confidence in deaf community settings." The prospect of attending a program specifically designed for deaf students filled Victoria with an excitement that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. She had dreamed of meeting other deaf young people, but the possibility had seemed so remote that she had barely allowed herself to hope for such an opportunity. "Would I really be able to attend?" Victoria signed and spoke, wanting to make sure she understood correctly that her father was seriously considering this major change in her educational approach. "The program runs for 6 weeks during the summer," Mary signed, her expression showing obvious pleasure at Victoria's enthusiastic response. "It would give you intensive exposure to deaf culture, advanced sign language instruction, and friendships with other deaf teenagers who share similar experiences." Richard nodded as he watched Mary's signing, Victoria realized that her father had been learning to follow basic sign language during their 2-hour meeting. This unexpected development suggested that Richard was making genuine efforts to understand and support Victoria's communication preferences rather than simply tolerating them. I've also arranged for Mary to transition from general household duties to a full-time position as your educational coordinator, Richard announced, causing both Victoria and Mary to look at him with surprise and delight. Her background in deaf education makes her overqualified for housekeeping work, and your progress under her instruction demonstrates that you need specialized support. Victoria could hardly believe that her father was not only supporting her sign language education, but creating a permanent position that would ensure Mary's continued presence in her life. This decision represented a complete transformation in Richard's approach to his daughter's needs and a recognition that her development required resources beyond traditional tutoring and speech therapy. What would my new responsibilities include? Mary asked, her professional demeanor showing appropriate interest in the specific duties and expectations that would accompany this expanded role. You would coordinate Victoria's overall educational program, Richard explained, including her academic tutoring, sign language instruction, and preparation for the summer program at the deaf school. You would also serve as her interpreter and communication facilitator for family meetings, social events, and any situations where her needs require specialized support. The idea of having an interpreter for family communications excited Victoria tremendously. For years, she had felt excluded from dinner conversations, family discussions about future plans, and the kind of casual interactions that most families took for granted. Mary's presence as a communication bridge could transform Victoria's relationship with her father and her sense of belonging within her own family. I'm honored to accept this position, Mary signed and spoke, her expression showing genuine appreciation for Richard's recognition of her qualifications and Victoria's needs. I believe Victoria has tremendous potential that we've only begun to explore. Richard smiled at Mary's response and turned back to Victoria with an expression that combined paternal affection with business-like determination. These changes represent significant investments in your education and development, he said. I expect you to take full advantage of these opportunities and to work hard to achieve your maximum potential. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, understanding that her father's support came with expectations for serious commitment to her learning and growth. She felt ready to meet those expectations and grateful for the chance to finally pursue educational opportunities designed specifically for deaf students. There's one more development I want to discuss, Richard continued, reaching for a folder on the nearby table. I've been researching colleges and universities with strong programs for deaf students. Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., offers undergraduate programs conducted entirely in American Sign Language, with a deaf faculty and student body. The mention of Gallaudet University sent another wave of excitement through Victoria. She had discovered information about this famous deaf institution during her online research, but she had never imagined that college attendance might be a realistic possibility given her father's previous emphasis on integration into hearing environments. Gallaudet represents the pinnacle of deaf higher education. Mary signed with obvious enthusiasm. Students there develop advanced academic skills while becoming leaders in deaf community organizations and professional fields. It would be an ideal environment for someone with Victoria's intelligence and potential. Victoria looked between her father and Mary, trying to absorb the magnitude of the changes they were proposing for her future. Within the span of a few weeks, her life had transformed from isolated endurance to exciting possibilities that included specialized education, peer relationships, and professional preparation in environments designed specifically for deaf individuals. These are long-term goals, Richard cautioned, but I want you to understand that your educational opportunities are not limited by your deafness when we approach your development with appropriate resources and expertise. Mary's presence in our household has helped me recognize that I was inadvertently limiting your potential by focusing too narrowly on speech and lip-reading skills. Victoria felt tears of gratitude and relief beginning to form as she realized that her father had not only accepted her need for sign language communication, but was actively planning for educational experiences that would help her thrive as a deaf person rather than struggle as someone trying to function in hearing environments without adequate support. "Thank you," Victoria signed and spoke to both her father and Mary, her expression conveying the depth of her appreciation for their advocacy and support. "I never imagined that my life could include these kinds of opportunities." Mary moved closer to Victoria and signed, "This is just the beginning. You have years of growth and discovery ahead of you, surrounded by people who understand and value your potential." The afternoon following the meeting felt like a celebration as Victoria and Mary planned for the expanded educational program that would begin immediately. Mary's new role allowed for longer and more frequent instructional sessions, and her access to deaf education resources meant that Victoria's learning could accelerate dramatically in preparation for the summer program. "We'll need to build your vocabulary quickly," Mary signed as they reviewed materials about the summer program. "The other students will have varying levels of sign language fluency, but you'll want to be confident enough to participate fully in social activities and group discussions." Victoria threw herself into intensive study with energy and enthusiasm that surprised even Mary with its intensity. The prospect of finally belonging to a community where her deafness was understood and accepted rather than accommodated motivated her to work harder than she had ever worked on any academic subject. Within 2 weeks, Victoria's sign language skills had advanced to the point where she could engage in complex conversations about literature, history, and current events. Her natural intelligence, combined with Mary's expert instruction and her own desperate hunger for communication, created rapid progress that impressed everyone who observed her development. The household staff noticed the dramatic change in Victoria's demeanor and energy levels. Maria, the cook, commented to Mrs. Patterson that Victoria seemed like a completely different person who smiled frequently and moved through the house with confidence rather than the tentative caution that had characterized her previous behavior. Richard Harrison began joining Victoria and Mary for dinner twice a week, using these occasions to practice his own developing sign language skills while learning about Victoria's thoughts and interests through extended conversation for the first time in years. These family meals became highlights of Victoria's week, representing the kind of normal family interaction she had dreamed about but never experienced. "I'm beginning to understand how much I missed about your personality and intelligence," Richard signed awkwardly but earnestly during one of these dinners. "I thought I was helping you by focusing on speech, but I was actually preventing you from showing me who you really are." Victoria appreciated her father's acknowledgement of his previous misunderstanding, but she felt more interested in building their future relationship than dwelling on past limitations. "We're learning together now," she signed back. "That's what matters most." As the weeks passed and summer approached, Victoria's excitement about the program at the deaf school grew alongside her confidence in her ability to succeed in that environment. Mary's preparation had given her not only language skills, but also cultural knowledge about deaf community values, social customs, and the kinds of relationships that flourished when communication barriers were removed. The night before Victoria's departure for the summer program, she sat in her room packing clothes and books while reflecting on the amazing transformation that had occurred in her life since Mary's arrival at the mansion. The isolation and silence that had defined her childhood had been replaced by communication, community, and possibilities that extended far beyond anything she had previously imagined. Mary knocked on Victoria's door and entered with a small wrapped gift. "I wanted to give you something special before you begin this new adventure," she signed with a warm smile. Victoria unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal embossed with her initials and the Gallaudet University seal. Inside the front cover, Mary had written in both English and ASL symbols, "For recording your journey into the deaf community where you belong. You are not alone anymore." Tears of joy and gratitude filled Victoria's eyes as she hugged Mary and signed, "Thank you for everything. You saved my life." Mary hugged her back and signed, "You saved your own life by having the courage to embrace who you are. I just helped you discover the tools you needed." The following morning, Victoria Harrison left the mansion that had been her beautiful prison for 15 years, traveling toward a summer program that would introduce her to a community where her deafness was not a barrier to overcome, but a culture to embrace. Behind her, she left a father who had learned to see her potential rather than her limitations, and a friend who had given her the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that she was not alone in the world. The girl who had spent years watching other people communicate from behind glass doors was finally stepping into a world where she belonged, where her hands could speak fluently, and where her intelligence and personality could shine without the constraints that had hidden her true self for so long. Victoria's story of isolation was ending, and her story of belonging was just beginning. His expression showed the kind of paternal affection that Victoria remembered from her early childhood, before her deafness had created barriers between them that neither of them had known how to bridge. "I want you to be happy and successful, Victoria," Richard said, his voice gentler than usual. "If sign language contributes to those goals, then we'll find ways to support your learning. But I also want to make sure we're making decisions based on solid evidence rather than just emotional reactions to new possibilities." Victoria nodded, understanding her father's need to approach this decision with the same careful analysis that characterized his business investments. She felt confident that Mary's qualifications and Victoria's obvious progress would convince Richard that sign language represented a valuable addition to rather than a replacement for her existing educational program. That evening, Victoria wrote extensively in her journal about the conversation with her father and her hopes for the upcoming meeting between Richard and Mary. For the first time since Mary's arrival, Victoria felt that her future might include the kind of educational and social opportunities that would allow her to develop her full potential as a deaf person rather than as a hearing person who happened to be unable to hear. The weekend stretched ahead with new anticipation as Victoria prepared for a family dynamic that might finally recognize and support her actual communication needs and cultural identity. The isolated mansion that had felt like a beautiful prison for so many years was beginning to feel like the starting point for a much larger and more exciting life. Intelligent, interesting person who has been isolated far too long. "We're going to change that, starting tomorrow." After Mary left, Victoria remained in the library for another hour, replaying every moment of their conversation and marveling at the ease and naturalness of communication through sign language. For the first time in her life, she had experienced the joy of being truly understood by another person, and the feeling was intoxicating in its power. She wrote extensively in her journal that evening, documenting not only the specific content of their conversation, but also her emotional responses to finally having someone who could communicate with her fluently. Mary's arrival represented the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where isolation and silence might give way to connection and understanding. As Victoria prepared for bed, she practiced the new signs Mary had taught her, including vocabulary related to emotions and experiences that she had never been able to express clearly before. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed hands that moved with increasing confidence, and she could envision a future where sign language might become as natural and fluent as Mary had made it appear. The possibility of friendship, community, and genuine communication created an excitement that made sleep elusive despite her emotional exhaustion from the day's revelations. Victoria Harrison was discovering that her world was much larger than the isolated mansion where she had spent her entire life, and that realization filled her with hope that she hadn't felt since early childhood. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to talk with Mary, and Victoria fell asleep planning questions and topics that would help her make the most of this unprecedented access to someone who truly understood her need to be heard and valued for who she was rather than pitted for what she lacked. Victoria wrote several paragraphs about her hopes and concerns regarding Mary's presence in the house. She worried that her father might disapprove of sign language communication and restrict her interactions with the new staff member. But she also allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to have daily conversations with someone who could understand her questions and respond with detailed answers. As she prepared for bed, Victoria practiced the sign language alphabet she had memorized from online videos, spelling out words and phrases while looking at herself in her bedroom mirror. Her movements felt awkward and uncertain, but She could see the potential for this visual language to become a natural and efficient form of expression. She turned off her lights and settled under her covers, watching the familiar shadows play across her ceiling while her mind raced with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring her first full day with Mary working somewhere in the house, and Victoria felt hopeful that this new presence might represent the beginning of a different kind of life. The security lights continued their nightly patterns outside her windows, and the household staff completed their evening routines in the floors below. But tonight these familiar sounds and movements seemed less isolating. Someone in the house now possessed the skills to communicate with her directly, and Victoria fell asleep imagining conversations that might finally bridge the silence that had surrounded her for 15 years. Her dreams were filled with gestures and expressions that conveyed meaning, understanding, and connection in ways that spoken words had never achieved for her. For the first time in years, Victoria Harrison looked forward to tomorrow with genuine excitement about what the day might bring. Somewhere in her carefully ordered world, there might be someone who could help her find a way out of the silence that surrounded her. She imagined what it might feel like to have a real conversation, to share her thoughts and dreams with someone who understood not just her words, but her need to be truly heard. The mansion settled into its nighttime quiet around her. 30 rooms of expensive emptiness that contained one lonely girl's dreams of connection and belonging. Outside, the security guards continued their rounds. The gardener's tools waited in neat arrangements for morning, and the household staff prepared for another day of maintaining a perfect house for a family that barely knew how to live in it together. Victoria's last conscious thought was a wish that tomorrow might somehow be different, that the new day might bring someone into her life who would see past her deafness to the intelligent, eager person she knew herself to be. She had no way of knowing that change was already on its way, in the form of a new staff member who would arrive the following Monday with skills and understanding that could transform everything about Victoria's isolated world. /